special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or there's special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
Well, I was going to go back again on where the idea of postponing the speech first initiated. Did the President initiate
yes,
the idea?
the President initiated the idea of postponing the speech.
Sorry, will the shuttle program be suspended at least until the investigation is through?
Those determinations have not been made. The President indicated to Bill Graham that he should find out the cause of it and then proceed. Now, exactly how that dovetails with future flights will just have to be determined as a result of what NASA determines in their investigation.
Also, on the consideration of whether any civilians will be permitted to continue on shuttle flights, is that also part of the investigation?
Well, to echo the President's words that all of these people were Americans. They were all interested in space. They all came first with courage and second in a spirit of volunteering for this mission, and whether there'll be any change in that, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think there's any inclination. Joe?
Has the President attempted to contact the family members of anyone who was on the
The President has not yet done that, no, except to send the Vice President in expression of his concern.
Is there any feeling here that NASA was pushing too hard? There was a very ambitious program. Was it 15 launches for this year?
I think NASA has a very good record of safety and a very cautious human approach to space exploration, and they have taken those precautions. This is a tragedy of major proportions and one that concerns us all. But for the moment, there is no finger pointing at NASA as far as their safety record.
Well, the question arises particularly because in recent launches there have been some glitches that have come up. As you know, they had a problem with the door, the hatch on this, and their drill wouldn't work and all of that. Does that not give the impression that they may be pushing too fast?
I can't make that judgment from here, but I think if you would look back at other space launches in the Mercury and Apollo program, you would find that there have been postponements. These not because of glitches, but because of an extensive safety program that finds these glitches before launch.
Can you be more specific about what the Vice President will be doing later today specifically, and also the postponement on the State of the Union pushed back the schedule for the budget and other things that were scheduled for next week?
The Vice President's schedule, once he arrives at the Cape, has not been determined, since it's just within the last few moments that the President has asked him to go down.
Well, what's his specific charge? I mean, when
his specific charge, once again, is to express the President's concern to the families and to accompany the Director of NASA down to the Cape in order to see that the President's directions for an immediate look into the tragedy, into the explosion, is accomplished.
Is he overseeing an investigation into this?
I don't think that you can say that yet, Norm. I think this matter is entirely in the hands of the NASA people at the present time, and I don't know of any. There's no further planning beyond that. Question on the budget, that has not been determined. It would be my inclination to say that the budget will probably go up on Wednesday, with the State of the Union on Tuesday. I think the Graham-Rudman law requires that it go up by February 5th, and that they will do. Andrew, and then I'm going to go all the way to the back and work forward.
I just want to follow on Norm. Is it the President's view that perhaps an independent investigation outside of NASA is what is required on the pacing of the program? And
I think everyone is leapfrogging well ahead of events at present. This tragedy is now only hours old. You have a series of actions taken by the President, including a charge to the Director of NASA to find out what happened. And until we do some preliminary studies, none of these questions have answers. So, Pat?
Has the decision been made to have the president officially disclose tonight in his speech what happened, or will we continue to get details from NASA throughout the day, or are they going to hold the president's speech?
NASA will continue to keep you abreast of everything as they know it, as they always have through the entire history of the American space program. So, John?
Larry, you made a point of saying early on that there would be no greater way to honor those who apparently have died in this mission than to continue on with the space program. Is this a deliberate effort to try to counteract any feelings against the program because of the tragedy?
John, the only deliberate effort we're making at the moment is to show our deep concern, our deep emotion, and our desire that America continue in the space program. That's our entire motive, lock, stock, and barrel. Joanna?
Larry, has the president expressed any rue or regret about his proposal to send civilians in space?
The president is obviously concerned about every person that he, as the chief executive officer of the government, he as the president directs. He directs people every day, either directly or indirectly, to conduct missions on the part of the government, the military, NASA, and those. It's a fact of life when the man sits in the Oval Office. He has to make these decisions, and I have not heard him express any regret. Concern, yes. Deep emotion, yes. Sorrow, yes. But regret is not that. It was the decision made, as he said, these individuals are all Americans, and they're all believers in the space program, and that's what's in his mind. So, Walter?
Larry, does the president plan today to speak with any of the relatives, family of any of the...
that hasn't been determined yet, no. Frank?
Can you give us any indication as to what the First Lady was doing at the time that this information became available and what her reaction was?
I don't. We can check with her office, if you will, and see what we can get.
Because the Europeans are able to put up satellites in with unmanned vehicles, doesn't this accident argue per se that unmanned vehicles are a preferable way to put up satellites in orbit?
Once again, I have been a silent observer of the space program and not one that's actively involved, and I'm not competent to answer that. So.
As you recall, the president made the decision to send a teacher into space. Can you tell us on what he based that decision and who suggested the timing and when the time was right for that mission?
Well, Mike, I don't want to come down hard on you, but what's in the president's mind right now is to find out what happened and to show those families of those people that he's concerned. And that's all that's on his mind at the moment.
Are you operating on the assumption that this is the result of some technological problem, or has anyone suggested the possibility it might be an act of terrorism?
There have been no suggestions either way.
Thank you.
Larry Speaks in the White House press briefing room, just completing that live briefing to reporters who are assembled there. He made several major announcements. The President's State of the Union address tonight has been postponed until Tuesday of next week. The White House saying that the President initiated that decision. We also had word from Capitol Hill that both House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill and the Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole of Kansas concurred in that decision, that there were efforts being made up there even before the White House came to its decision that they ought to, in fact, postpone tonight's State of the Union address. The President, however, will address the nation tonight from the Oval Office. The time, as of now, undetermined. As soon as we have that time for you, of course, we'll bring it to you. Vice President Bush and the administrator of NASA will be dispatched to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida today, where they will be the President's personal representatives to determine what has happened there. It has now been about 2.5 hours since this tragedy occurred, this traumatic shock to the nation. 7 astronauts apparently lost in a gigantic explosion about 5 miles up in space, about 1 minute and 15 seconds after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger today. It was witnessed by the parents, the husband and the children of Christa McAuliffe, who is the school teacher, of course, riding along today, and apparently she has been lost. Also, members of her third grade class were there with a banner that read, "Go, Christa, go." In Concord, New Hampshire, the high school had been assembled in an auditorium, 1,500 altogether, to watch on television this launch. And across the country, for that matter, young people have been watching what happened today, and it's bound to have a traumatic effect on youngsters as well as those of us who are grown-ups and think that we are used to the unexpected in life and find out that we are not. To help us deal with all that now is Dr. Ravenscroft, Ken Ravenscroft, who is from Georgetown University. He's a child psychiatrist. Dr. Ravenscroft, as the parent of youngsters, what would I say to them tonight as we discuss this around the dinner table?
Well, I think one of the major things actually is to find out, first of all, to let them know you're aware of what's happened, and then to find out from them what they've been through so far that day. Obviously, parents have to react. They're stunned, they're in grieving, they are having whatever range of reactions they're having, and I think it's healthy and natural to show that and to communicate it. Some care perhaps not to overwhelm, and to keep some reserve and attune themselves to exactly what their kids have been through that day.
After the kids have seen this on television, we've shown it a number of times now because we have a rotating audience coming in and going out and so on. Would you as a parent say to your child, I just think you've watched it enough now and maybe it'd be a good idea to get away from the television set for a time?
Well, I think that that overdoing it is going to take time away from perhaps what needs to be done, which is some containment and some support by the part of the parents. I think, though, it's not a time to get into major confrontations about something like this, but rather to be with them with what they're doing, but also to make it clear you're available to talk about it. This thing is going to unfold over several hours, days, and weeks, and there's no real predicting how any given child, because each child's a different age and a different person, how they're going to react. So the key thing is to find out how they're processing it and dealing with it in order to be able to respond to that.
And should you share your own vulnerabilities, your own feeling of shock and grief as well?
I think that's key. For many of these children, they haven't been through a tragedy of this magnitude and this level that really disrupts the sense of trust in the world and parents and government and technology. These kids have grown up taking the shuttle now, perhaps many of them, for granted. And because of Christa, there is a heavy personal identification and immediacy to it that intensifies the whole thing and the focus. So that parents who have been through this kind of thing before, I think, can model to some degree what it's like. And it's not modeling, it's genuine. You have this kind of effort, this kind of power involved in a technological effort, and as John Glenn just said, we get to taking it for granted, and yet there's bound to be something like this that's going to happen. And at that point, you realize that with great efforts and endeavors, tragedy can happen.
It's an experience that's not only a common bond for the nation, but it is especially a common bond for families, for parents and children.
Exactly.
And to talk it out is the best thing.
Yeah. Well, one key thing, kids often, the younger kids, don't like to be put on the spot. They really would prefer not to be pressured. So the key thing is to ask them perhaps how their classmates reacted, how other people reacted, and through their indirect comments you can really warm them up or get a sense of how they're reacting, and then at that point maybe deal with it from your own point of view.
Dr. Ravenscroft, thanks very much for coming in today.
Okay, thank you.
In a sense, the space program is one of the great common bonds of this country. In a way, we're all passengers on those flights when they go off, whether we're interested in the technology or not. You know, we identify with the astronauts. They are, as I indicated earlier, our folk heroes. We know them. If not personally, we know them by reputation, and not as well as we did the original group, of course, but still, they are part of the folklore of American life, and therefore, when something like this happens, it's bound to affect all of us. John Palmer is in New York now. John?
Right, Tom, we understand that NASA officials are going to hold a briefing at 3:30 Eastern Time at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral to give us the latest of their theories of what might have happened. And of course, we're waiting for any word that we can get at that point, 18 or 25 miles off the coast where the debris from the Space Shuttle Challenger went down, to find out what they have found. The latest word we had about 45 minutes ago that they found no significant pieces of debris there, no pieces of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and of course they saw at that point no loss of life. We do have learned that the House of Representatives is going to meet in special session this afternoon to pass a resolution of sympathy for the shuttle crew. And as we heard earlier, the President has canceled his State of the Union address tonight, but he will address the American people tonight when he gets more details of what happened and the fate of the crew from NASA officials. And he also, of course, said that he has dispatched Vice President Bush immediately down to Cape Canaveral there to express condolences to members of the family, and he is being joined there by the acting NASA Administrator, Fred Graham. We want to now play once again the tape of this tragedy to you. It occurred at 11:38 Eastern Time this morning after the launch had been delayed a couple of hours today because of some icicles. It finally got off the ground at about 11:38, and as you can see, it lifted off the pad very smoothly. There appear to be no difficulties whatsoever. But it was not long after that that fragments from the $1.2 billion spacecraft and the 7 astronauts aboard until that fell into the ocean. There is doubt, of course, that any astronaut or person could survive. The explosion occurred as the Challenger was about 10 miles high, speeding toward orbit at 1,977 miles an hour. This is some members of the family of Christa McAuliffe, a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, watching there at the stands. Her husband, Stephen, was also there, as well as her 9-year-old daughter. We're moving up now to the time. There's a very close-up picture of this brilliant flash in the sky, this explosion. The theory being, obviously, it had to do with one of the fuel tanks. Just what happened, nobody knows, but it could well have been the tearing of the seam that attaches the spacecraft itself to the main rocket engine. They are moving to the point of separation. The explosion occurred about 30 seconds before the solid booster rockets normally fall off, and you many times have seen that. Here is the close-up, and there is the explosion aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger happening about 11:39 Eastern Time, and you see now what appears to be one of the solid booster rockets. This again is the family. This is Christy McAuliffe, astronaut, or rather Teacher McAuliffe's family there. Her mother, her father there, other members of the family. At first they didn't know what was happening. Then it became clear when they said they had a major problem, and then the communications people down at NASA at the Cape, over the public relations or public address system, stated that there had been an explosion. A tragedy indeed. It is the first loss of American life aboard in flight, aboard the shuttle or any other kind of spacecraft in flight. Of course, there was a tragedy back in January of 1967 when Virgil Grissom and 2 other astronauts died in a fire aboard an Apollo spacecraft. But since that time, there has been no loss of life until today, when we can only but sadly presume that 7 Americans, including the first school teacher, the first, if you will, regular person, regular citizen up in space, apparently have been lost. One of the next flights was going to be taking a journalist into space. As the program was very ambitious for this year, they hope to send as many as 15 shuttle flights. There have been delays on the first one. There were delays and on this one also, several days of delays because of weather, one thing or another. You'll recall yesterday the problem seemed to have been with a screwdriver that delayed them for some time, and by that time the weather was not very favorable. This morning there was the scheduled liftoff was 9:38 Eastern Time, but there was a problem there with the freezing temperatures overnight. It dropped below the freezing point, and icicles developed on the main body of the spacecraft. That concerned the officials at NASA a little bit, so they delayed the flight. They even sent some people there to chip off some of those icicles. Then they determined that it really wasn't going to be much of a problem. About 10 o'clock it became above the freezing point, and they thought there would be no danger of the icicles during launch falling off and hitting the protective shield, those tiles. So nobody knows at this particular time what the problem was, but it is indeed a tragedy of the first magnitude in the space program. There's a lot of speculation that we've heard this afternoon of what this means to the space program. Obviously, there's going to be a delay while no launches ever takes place. That's an old NASA rule until they find out what happened on the last one, even if it's just a minor glitch. And of course, we have more than a minor glitch. We have a full-blown tragedy. Let's go back now to Washington, D.C. and Tom Brokaw. Tom?
Thank you, John. Dan Molina is in Houston now, and we each have, I think, a model of the space shuttle as it is attached to the two solid rocket boosters, which are on either side of it here. I'll turn it so that you can see. These are the solid rocket boosters, and this is the external tank that we've been talking about all day long. What appeared to happen is that something happened down here where it attaches to the shuttle itself, and it fuels these main engines, and it appears to our naked eye, and not expert eye, although we've all been watching these for some time, it appears that that's where the explosion might have occurred just after these main engines were pushed forward to 104% or full throttle. They run at about 65% for the opening moments of the flight, up to about 1 minute, and then they push them forward so that they'll have enough to get into the orbit that they want to achieve. Under normal conditions, these two solid rocket boosters then would peel away and they would be parachuted back to Earth. And this big external tank, which is a very thin-skinned vessel containing, as I indicated earlier, almost 600,000 pounds of hydrogen and oxygen, then that just breaks up and goes off into space. But what happened today is that the entire system came apart. It exploded in a gigantic fireball. Dan Molina at Houston now, who's also, as I understand it, has one of these models. Dan, any further word down there, even speculation from some of the NASA officials?
Tom, interestingly, I had a conversation by phone about 20 minutes ago with a man whose name is very, very well known in the NASA space program, Dr. Max Faget. I know that name is familiar to you. Dr. Faget is well known as the father of the space shuttle. Dr. Faget is retired from NASA now, but he was the chief designer of the space shuttle. I called him at his office. He now works for a private consulting firm, and asked him what he thought, what his first impressions were. He said that unless something shows up on long-range telescopes or on telemetry, we may never know what happened. And Dr. Faget said that that would be the worst thing of all, because there would be no way to push on from that point. I asked him, Tom, about the fact that the explosion occurred, as you pointed out, at the point where they throttle up to 140% of the shuttle's capacity. He then said, and perhaps it is a revealing comment, he said, yes, that is a glaring coincidence. I asked him if there were any flaws historically that he could recall, any things that concerned him or his team as he designed the shuttle that could possibly have resulted in something like this. He said no, but he remembered again that happened, the explosion happened at the moment when there is the most pressure on the shuttle. He called it highly loaded at that point, the point when, if anything was to happen, it would be the most disastrous result, and that, of course, was a disastrous result that we have seen. The orbital flight testing program, that was the first 4 flights of the space shuttle. During those 4 flights, there was a lot of instrumentation, extra instrumentation on the shuttle Columbia, to measure these kinds of things, to measure the pressure at various points on the shuttle's fuselage, to measure how the fuel was going through those lines, properly, improperly. But they took most of that instrumentation off after the first 4 flights, as they took off the ejection seats that in an emergency were planned to allow the crew to eject from the shuttle into the water. But one moment, Tom, we're hearing one announcement here.
Beginning at 3:30 p.m.
We're hearing a repeat of the announcement that there will be a press briefing this afternoon at 3:30 by Jess Moore, who is the NASA Associate Administrator for the Space Shuttle program. Carrying on, the ejection seats were removed because at that point they thought there was just no possibility of this serious a tragedy. No possibility in some people's minds, but in the astronauts' minds, Tom, as you have said, as Bob Bazell, Roy Neal has said this morning, if you talk to the astronauts, they knew that one day something serious would happen. They knew there was that possibility, as you have said, Tom. They're riding on a big bomb, a very, very powerful bomb, the most complex machine ever built, and they knew something could happen. Today it did. Once more to review, as you were saying, Tom, people may not remember exactly what the components of the shuttle are. These are the solid rocket boosters. They provide 2 million pounds of thrust. This, the huge external tank, and the orbiter saddled on the outside of it. Tom?
Thank you very much, Dan Molina. I had just been talking with somebody recently, a friend of mine in New York, who's watched a lot of the shuttle launches and never has fully understood just what does happen. This, in effect, becomes an airplane, a space airplane. After all this falls off, the shuttle then goes into launch, and as you can see, it looks like an airplane as I turn it to you. And then we see it land, often at Edwards Air Force Base in California, or at the Kennedy Space Center, as they're now attempting to do. And all that airplane, and the crew sits right up here. It's a kind of a two-stage cockpit. That airplane is attached to all of this fuel, and so it is a highly volatile operation. What is also a volatile operation today is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Its headquarters here in Washington, D.C., and Robert Hager is standing by there now. Bob?
Tom, this is an auditorium here at the headquarters where the civil servants who man the desks at NASA gathered through the morning to hear this sad news from the Cape. They were stunned, they were shocked. As you said, the agency itself has been in some disarray. Their budget for ongoing projects coming in about $200 million less than they'd asked for. There were $480 million believed to be cut from the upcoming budget for the space station program, which the agency had hoped would be its next big project. James Beggs, the former administrator, is now on a leave of absence because of activities in a prior job when he was at General Dynamics and was a vice president there, and he's under indictment on a charge of defrauding the government, so he had to step aside. He is, as I say, on a leave of absence, so they have an acting administrator now in William Graham, so he's a new man on the job, although he's a longtime confidant to the president and to the Reagan administration generally. So things were already in some disarray here, and this is, beyond the human side of it, going to be an administrative blow for NASA. Tom?
Thanks, Robert Hager, who is standing by in Washington and at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California now. NBC News Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell, who's been an applicant for the Journalist in Space program and has watched almost all of these liftoffs. Bob, what are your thoughts about the future of NASA now? It is, as Bob Hager indicated, an agency that is under considerable stress already. And on Capitol Hill this afternoon, they're talking about the budget constraints. To replace this shuttle that blew up today cost more than $1 billion altogether. So NASA has problems that we can't even foresee at this time. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, there certainly are. There's the problems associated with this immediate accident, which will certainly have long-term effects. But there were problems before this accident, and it's important to keep them in mind that they were there before. And one of the problems is that the Space Shuttle program has cost an enormous amount of money, more than was originally predicted. It was supposed to have been paying for itself long ago. It has yet to come close to paying for itself. So there's been a lot of pressure on Capitol Hill and in other places to have more and more unmanned space probes, such as the Voyager probe to distant planets that we've been covering here. But even to have more of the activities in orbit that the shuttle has been carrying out to be done by unmanned robots, because for a lot of these things it looks wonderful when it works well that human beings are doing it, but in fact it isn't necessary and it'd be a lot cheaper. There was that pressure on NASA beforehand, and there certainly is going to be more of that pressure now.
All right, thanks very much. That's Robert Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, where he had been assigned to record one of the triumphs in space, the successful flight of the Voyager spacecraft, which just this past week has returned to Earth. Those remarkable pictures of the moons from Uranus. And the spacecraft, the Voyager now, is going on from there to take a look at Neptune. Back here on Earth, we're dealing with this enormous tragedy, the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger today, about 1 minute and 15 seconds after it took off from the Kennedy Space Center with 7 people on board, including, as we continue to point out, the schoolteacher Christa McAuliffe, the first real civilian outside any governmental agency or governmental body to fly on the shuttle. And it appears that she was able to fly for only about 1 minute and 15 seconds. There has been no sign of survivors of any kind whatsoever. Small pieces of debris continue to rain down for about 40 minutes in a wide stretch of ocean off the east coast of Florida today. These are the people who are on board. We want to show them to you now and talk briefly as we can. The crew on board. Francis Richard Scobee was the pilot. He's 46 years old. Scobee has logged more than 6,500 hours in 45 types of aircraft, and he was the commander of this spacecraft today. Dick Scobee was a friend of Bob Bazell's and said to him recently, there's a possibility that one of these could blow up one day. Gregory Jarvis a Hughes aircraft payload specialist, also on board. He'd been waiting for years for mission. The payload specialists are the people who work with the experiments, of course. "41 years old. And Christa McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, chosen in nationwide competition. Her husband and 2 children watching today along with her parents. She was 37 years old. Christa McAuliffe was to conduct Classrooms in Space. It was part of a program announced by President Reagan during the 1984 presidential campaign. Ronald McNair, 35 years old, one of the few black astronauts, was also on board today. He was a laser physics expert. He enjoyed what he called the fantasy of space. And this is Ellison Onizuka. Ellison Onizuka was the first Japanese-American in space. He was on board, an Air Force major. He was a flight test engineer who took part in America's first manned military space flight. Judy Resnik, who had made an earlier flight. She helped pave the way for sexual equality for women in space. She was looking for a way to broaden her career as an electronics expert when she left her native Akron, Ohio, looking for the adventure of space. Enthusiastic. And this is Michael Smith, the 40-year-old Shuttle co-pilot, a crack naval aviator and test pilot. They like nothing better than an afternoon of quiet woodworking or a quick game of squash. He had flown 28 different types of civilian and military aircraft, logging more than 4,200 hours of flying time, including 3,900 hours in jet aircraft. The can-do crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger, now apparently lost in a tremendous fireball explosion out over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida. Rescue crews continue to screen the area looking for whatever debris they can recover, any signs of life. So far, no word of any survivors. John Palmer's in New York. John?
Yes, Tom, some stations along the line may be leaving the network to do local programming, but we will, however, continue network coverage of this tragic event. We'd like to show you now 2 launches, the tragic launch today of the Space Shuttle Challenger and the launch back on January 12th of the Space Shuttle Columbia. That was the one that was delayed for some 7 days, you'll recall. Here they are now, side by side, today's launch and the launch on January 12th of the Columbia. Some observers felt that today's launch was a little bit slower in getting off the pad. There's no real indication that the computers show that to be true. But at this point, everything appears to be going well. Both launches look pretty much the same, mirror launches. But as this flight of the Challenger on your left, as it moves to 1 minute and about 15 seconds into the flight, there is the tragic explosion, the ball of fire, and then you see the pieces falling to Earth. It was almost an hour, we think that time is about correct, before they could get the ships in the area, the Coast Guard cutters, 3 of them, and a frigate and a hydrofoil launched along with paramedics and helicopters to that area because so much debris was falling down. Now we're getting very close to the point of the explosion. Again, obviously, it was a fuel explosion. How it happened, nobody knows. And then there is that painful mention made by Dan Molina from one of the experts who helped design the shuttle that we may never know what happened. That, of course, would be very bad indeed as we go forward, and if we go forward in the Space Shuttle program as we are doing now. Now the close-up on your left, there is the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, about 11:39 Eastern Time, and those 2 prongs moving out. One of them we can certainly identify as one of the solid rocket boosters, perhaps the other is, and then you see all types of debris raining down in what, Tom, you described a little earlier as kind of a strange beauty there, a blue sky. The launch took off this morning. The weather was very clear, a delay for just a couple of hours there because of the weather conditions. To recap, it's been mentioned that the President has delayed or canceled his State of the Union address for tonight. He's moved it for 1 week. The House will meet in session, and they will, of course, pay tribute to the astronauts. Vice President Bush is now heading down toward the Cape. He is going with the acting administrator, Donald Graham. And also we expect to find a little bit more about, hopefully a lot more about what happened coming up in a little less than an hour now at 3:30 Eastern Time when NASA holds a news conference at the Kennedy Space Center at the Cape. Now back to Washington and Tom.
Thanks, John Palmer. We've just been handed a press release by something called Corroon and Black in Space, Inc. That's a leading United States and international satellite and space insurance brokerage firm. It announced today, earlier, that it had donated a personal accident insurance policy to Sharon Christa McAuliffe, the high school teacher who will be the first private citizen to fly aboard the shuttle. The policy provides $1 million of coverage and includes all of McAuliffe's activities while she is riding as a passenger aboard the Orbiter Challenger on this mission. That was donated before the launch of today's flight, the launch that was tragically witnessed by Christa McAuliffe's husband, her 2 children, and her parents. Steve Delaney is at the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida, where George Bush and the acting administrator of NASA will be headed under President Reagan's directions. Steve? Apparently we're having some audio difficulties, of course, with Steve Delaney, who's at the Cape. We want to just bring you up to date on what is likely to happen. We're going to have continuing coverage here on NBC News until this story is resolved in one form or another, and then we'll continue our coverage even after that. President Reagan has scheduled a special address to the nation tonight from the Oval Office directly. There has been a postponement of the State of the Union speech, which was scheduled before a joint session of Congress at 9 o'clock tonight, now postponed for 1 full week, as the enormity of this tragedy begins to unfold, really, for all of us, individually and collectively. The tragedy begins to really deepen and to have the effect that any kind of tragedy of this sort has on all of us, because we are bound together in so many ways by the space program, and in a way I suppose that all of us were riding with Christa McAuliffe today. And now let's go back to the Kennedy Space Center and Steve Delaney. Steve?
Yes, Tom. When Vice President Bush was first elected, was first in office early in 1981, I came down here with him to watch him go through a guided tour of the Columbia Space Shuttle, which was the first one to fly, had not yet flown. And he was met by astronauts Young and Crippen, who were the first crew, and they took him all over the thing. They walked him up the ramps, and they took him inside the control compartments, and they showed him the surfaces and explained to him what they were going to do. He's been closely associated with the space program ever since then, and was the one government official not too many months ago who was presiding over the ceremony in which Christa McAuliffe was selected as the first teacher to go into space, the first civilian, really, to go into space. Mr. Bush will be coming down here with a heavy burden. He will be the one who will try to convey the nation's condolences, the nation's sympathies on the loss of the crew, not only to the McAuliffe family, but to the families of the other astronauts who were here. Several of them were staying around town, and they together, because the crew composed seven different people, were quite a sizable contingent of family, well-wishers, close relatives, not so close relatives in some cases. Some of the flyers on this group had extensive families, and a lot of them were here. But the Vice President will come down. He will be one of those who will try in an official way to express his sympathy, the President's, the kinds of feelings that have caused the delay in the State of the Union message, which was scheduled for tonight. Officially, the United States government is putting aside its business in a way, so that through the offices of the Vice President and his associates who will be coming with him, they can try to ease the burdens and ease the pains of those who have felt this loss. It is not one of the brighter facets of the job of being Vice President, but it's that sort of duty that falls on one from time to time. So he'll be here later, and I'm sure that he'll be closeted in private with the survivors, the families of today's crew. Tom?
Thanks very much. Steve Delaney at the Kennedy Space Center. We'll ask you to stand by there, of course, until we get any kind of an official word. And we do expect in about 45 minutes from now that NASA will have a press briefing at the Cape Canaveral at the Kennedy Space Center there. With me now is Norman Baker. He's the editor of Defense Daily here in Washington, which is a publication of Space Publications Incorporated. This is obviously a great tragedy for the families of the astronauts that are involved and for the space program as well. Wouldn't you think that we'll have serious, enormous delays that we can't even foresee at this time in the space program, both politically and technologically and financially?
Well, yes, Tom, it's really hard to imagine what an effect it's going to have on it because, first off, this is the first major setback, truly major setback that the space program has had since its inception. We did have that Apollo 1 fire in which 3 astronauts were killed while they were testing the spacecraft on the ground. But all along, we have felt that this shuttle was designed with a reliability factor that we could actually set it up almost as an airliner. This is why we had all the civilians going aboard. And I think it has really set in a state of shock for the space program to realize that we had forgotten, really, how dangerous the program really could be.
You think that it was a mistake for NASA to have put civilians on board as early as they have?
No, I really don't think so, although one failure out of 25 launches is not a very good reliability. There's something drastically wrong here, and it's going to take some time, I'm afraid, to find out what went wrong.
And it was just 2 launches ago that we had some other indications of trouble with the main engine. Remember when when it shut down automatically and they thought that they may have to make a quick return?
Well, yes, and you know, there's so many factors here, so many parts that can go wrong. And I'm afraid this is not going to be one of those flights where we find out what went wrong with this one and we go on with the next one. I think there's going to be a lot of questions raised politically by the Congress of the United States and by the American people. Is this thing really a reliable system? Or do we want to go on with this until we can find maybe a better system?
Mr. Baker, that spacecraft cost $1.2 billion to build. It probably will cost, given the way things go here, about $1.5 billion to replace of some kind. This is a country that's operating under almost austerity conditions in terms of the federal government.
Yes, this is true. Well, also it takes 1/4 of the Space Shuttle program out of existence. There's only 4 of those spacecraft. And we may decide that this is the time to start looking at the follow-on manned spaceflight program. I don't think anyone is going to suggest that we stop the space program. I don't think they're going to suggest that we stop the manned spaceflight program. But they're going to have to reorient this program. One thing that most people haven't talked about yet is our entire space program, the military as well as civilian, was going to depend on that space shuttle.
You know, we had all of our eggs in that basket.
All the eggs, including our Star Wars. Our Strategic Defense Initiative was going to plan on that.
Which is the next point that I want to raise. Don't you think that the critics of President Reagan's SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program, will now have an open book from which they can criticize the president's plans to put that kind of a space defense out there?
Well, they will have a position here. They can criticize it because it's like anything that's on the edge of technology. Something can go wrong. And I don't think, though, that this will really stand up because, as I say, we have to go ahead. Remember, the Soviet Union is developing a space shuttle of their own. It looks almost exactly like this space shuttle. And will they stop? I don't think so. It's just going to require a real close examination of how we're going into space. And we're going to have to shift, for instance, the Defense Department will probably have to shift back to expendable vehicles until this problem is solved, so that we can keep our security programs going.
Do you know whether the Defense Department had some crucial missions planned for its own part of the Space Shuttle program that will now obviously have to be deferred?
It'll all depend on how long it is delayed. Well, they definitely had some very high priority programs planned. There's no question about that. Yeah. And, you know, they also had anticipated there would be problems with the Space Shuttle program, or either in scheduling or reliability problems, because they set up their own expendable launch vehicle program, which is now going through Congress getting approved. I'm sure they'll accelerate that so that they can continue with their particular spacecraft.
Mr. Baker, thanks very much for joining us today.
Certainly, thank you.
All right, the editor-in-chief of Defense Daily, that's a publication of Space Publications Incorporated, talking about the cold, hard political and economic realities now of the space program in the United States as a result of this tragedy today. John Palmer, Studio 3K in New York. John?
Thanks, Tom. You have raised there, and all day questions have been raised about what happened. Certainly, primary focal point, the fate of the 7 people aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. What happened? Why did it explode a minute and 15 seconds? Well, a lot of these questions, all of these questions, are going to be put to NASA administrators and associates down at Cape Canaveral less than an hour from now at 3:30 Eastern Time, when they will hold a news conference and at least answer all the questions they can at that particular time. Earlier this month on the NBC Today program, Bryant Gumbel interviewed Christa McAuliffe, the private citizen astronaut aboard the space shuttle, the first private citizen and a teacher. They talked about how she felt and so forth. We have that tape now. We'd like to show it to you. It begins with the ceremony and remarks from Vice President George Bush when he announced that she was going to be the first private citizen to go up on the shuttle.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Christa McAuliffe. Where's, can you? Christa teaches in Concord High School in Concord, New Hampshire. She teaches high school social studies. She's been teaching for 12 years. She plans to keep a journal of her experiences in space.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students wouldn't think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. When that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
Those 10 souls, of course, belong to Christa and the 9 other finalists who competed for that one special seat reserved for a teacher on next January's shuttle flight. Christa McAuliffe has joined us here this morning. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Bryant.
Simple question. Why you?
It's really hard to say. There were 10 people. We were such a cohesive group, enthusiastic, really enjoying teaching, and I think any one of us would have done a really good job. I don't know what put me over the top, and I'm delighted to be here.
When you first applied for this, did you think you had even a prayer?
I really didn't. I was almost doing it kind of like when you play the lottery. If you don't play it, you don't win.
Sure.
And when I filled out that application, that's really how I felt. I figured there'd be at least 50,000 people across the country who would be slipping that into the mailbox around the same time.
What about when you made it down to the last 10? Did you think then, maybe?
Well, then the possibility became very real, and I really started to think what the impact would be on my teaching career and on my family.
Yeah.
But it was still really exciting.
Has it all hit you yet?
No, I don't think so. I still can't believe that I'm going to actually be going into that shuttle. It just really doesn't seem possible. Maybe when I'm on the launch pad it will.
What are you most excited about?
Seeing the Earth from that perspective of that small planet, you know, it's such a big place here, but being able to look at it from a new perspective, and I hope I can bring that wonder and that excitement back to the students.
Maybe just a little bit of fright, too?
Not yet. Maybe when I'm strapped in and those rockets are going off underneath me, there will be, but space flight today really seems safe. We had a good example of that when NASA shut down the last one through the computer because one of the backup systems wasn't working.
You say it seems safe. A lot of people equate that with it also seems boring. Have you been one, have you been one who followed NASA efforts all along, long before?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I can remember watching the Vanguards as they went like this, and I remember Alan Shepard's first suborbital flight, and it was really thrilling.
I read where you said you wanted to demystify space. In plain talk, what does that mean?
Well, we see the space program as a science or math or technological adventure right now. I want the students to get a little bit of ownership. I want them to feel that they're part of the space age because they're the future and their children or grandchildren are going to be pioneering that. So I really hope to bring an ordinary person's perspective to this.
Have you heard from some of your students yet?
Yes, I have. They've been dropping by the house, they've been sending me cards, they've been calling. That's been super.
NASA, of course, has a selfish interest in all this. I mean, they want to build up public support for the huge outlays that are necessary to keep the program going. As part and parcel of being the first ordinary citizen, I mean, are you expected to be the ordinary speaker who's out there making speeches on NASA's behalf all along?
That's going to come. Certainly will, but I'm also delighted that the teaching profession and students and the whole country is really going to benefit from this. We hopefully are going to know an awful lot more about what life is like aboard the shuttle.
Yeah. You go up on January the 22nd.
That's what the date is, yes,
of 86,
right now.
and we're hoping that that'll be met. What are you most concerned about between now and then?
Well, probably just getting my life in order. I do have a family in Concord, New Hampshire, and I have to get them set. I also want to make sure my replacement in school is going to be comfortable for next year.
Any thoughts, however slight, that you might not measure up once it gets going?
Well, one of the things that has been really surprising is all of the publicity, and I was saying to my husband the other night, it's almost like I'm reading about somebody else, you know?
Well, it's a dream come true for you.
Oh, it certainly is.
Christa McAuliffe, congratulations.
Thank you again.
Good luck. We'll see you in January.
Thank you.
We'll take a break here. This is Today.
The first private citizen astronaut, Christa McAuliffe, there in an interview, a tape-recorded interview with Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show some weeks ago, talking about how proud she was to have been chosen to be a part of this space shot, this tragedy. It's all but now impossible to think that she could have really survived the crash today, the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, along with 6 of the astronauts, 7 altogether aboard the shuttle. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
John, that was such a poignant interview. You can see why she was so appealing and attractive to NASA. She was outgoing and enthusiastic, and of course she talked with great enthusiasm about the confidence that she had in the space agency itself. Today, that moment of triumph came for her and ended very shortly after liftoff, about 1 minute and 15 seconds, that enormous explosion, and as you indicated, no survivors. Christa McAuliffe and 6 other astronauts appear to have perished in that gigantic fireball about 5 miles up in space, 1 minute and 15 seconds after liftoff today. Dan Molina is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas now, where he's been keeping track of what information he can gather there. Dan?
Tom, no new information. I must say it seems so sad and strange to glance up at some of the information readouts that we get from NASA here. There's an indication, MET, mission elapsed time. That's the time that the mission would have lasted had it gone on. Oh, you can see it on your screen there. 3 hours, 12 minutes, 16, 17, 18 seconds. That's the amount of time that the mission would have lasted had it not ended in the terrible, terrible tragedy this morning. And I must echo John's observation. It seems all but impossible now to look back to this morning when we were talking about ice problems, little problems, something that NASA has been so cautious about, little problems all the way along the line. And this morning, though, it looked like those little problems were going to be overcome. We saw a very happy crew first thing this morning. You just saw Christa McAuliffe. There's the crew with their traditional breakfast, the cake in front of them. Everybody ready to go this morning. They had glitches along the line, but this morning there was that attitude like today we were going to get off the launch pad. We're ready to go. NASA's ready to go. We had an extra hour of sleep, I know they were thinking. They were delayed about an hour because there was a problem with an electronic fire detector that was on the pad itself. No indication that that electronic problem had anything to do with the accident today. There is Christa McAuliffe parading out with her fellow crew members, Onizuka giving a wave as they go into the elevator that would take them to the van that would then take them out to the launch pad. 7 members on this crew, a very experienced crew, being applauded there. Dick Scobee leading the way, mission commander. Judy Resnik behind him, Ron McNair, Mike Smith, all of them headed out to the launch pad, confident that today would be the day. We're going to go, they said earlier on today, headed for the van that would take them out to the launch pad. It was a very, very clear, very, very cold morning at the Cape today. We were talking about ice problems earlier on. There was the chance, if they lifted off with icicles around the shuttle, that one of those icicles might break off and damage the heat protection tiles. That would pose a hazard to re-entry, and so they were worried about that. They delayed because of that problem for some time, but there is, again, no connection between anything that could have resulted from that and the tragedy today. This is Christa McAuliffe putting on a vest that is full of life-preserving equipment should the shuttle land on the water. There is always that contingency that they plan for, as they plan for any number of them. That vest has a life preserver in it that could keep an astronaut afloat for some 24 hours, food and things like that. That's one of the contingencies that they plan for. There are ways that they can get out of that hatch and swing down into the water if, in fact, they were to land on the water. That contingency is one of several, as I say, that NASA plans for including the landing at one of several overseas landing sites. We were all very aware of the possibility of that some missions ago when a sensor indicated that a main engine had shut down on the shuttle. It turned out that it was the sensor's fault, not the engine's fault. Everybody was very scared about that, and we became very aware at that point of the possibility of something serious happening to the shuttle. People who are close to the program, astronauts all the time, say something's going to happen serious one day. But as you have pointed out, Tom, so many times this morning, and as so many observers have pointed out, it's become part of our lives. How could something happen to something that's as fun and as glamorous as the space shuttle? Well, today, obviously, it did, a tragedy of enormous proportions. Tom?
Thank you very much, Dan Molina. As we indicated recently, there's been a lot of attention about journalists going into space. Walter Cronkite appearing in Space Regalia on the front page of some newspapers and in magazines as well. Any number of us have applied to NASA, to a special screening committee that they have organized to see if we could be the first journalist to go into space as well. Obviously, the future of the journalist in space program remains very much up in air as well as the future of the Space Shuttle program. Someone who has watched all of this since the inception, and an original member of the Right Stuff group, was Deke Slayton. You'll remember him, one of the original astronauts who could not fly because of a heart murmur, later was able to go into space, now involved in a private space enterprise, hopes to launch communication satellites and others as well. He's with us now from Houston, Texas. Mr. Slayton, as you watch those videotape replays of what happened today, could you get any indication at all through the naked eye what may have gone wrong?
No, not really. I could just speculate like everybody else. If I had to speculate, I'd say it's probably a 90% probability something with the main engine, since they just did clearance to throttle up, and usually things fail when you're in a transient state. Everything else was apparently stable, so if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say that would be the high probability, but that could be totally wrong, and it'll take a lot of numbers crunching and data analysis to really sort it out.
Given the enormity of that fireball and what appeared to be the devastating effect of that on all of the equipment that may have been on board, will we ever know, do you think?
That's a good question. There's a lot of telemetry available, of course, and that'll be available to analyze from the records, and hopefully they'll sort out the precise cause. But we've had similar situations before, obviously without crews on board, where we didn't know the precise cause of an accident, and we did what we call a shotgun fix. We fix everything that could have caused it, and the system continues to work. We did that back in the Atlas program on Mercury.
Mr. Slayton, we've all been talking about the Space Shuttle program as if it's a routine shuttle flight from Washington to New York, talking about putting not just congressmen and senators up, but now school teachers and maybe even journalists in the future. Have we all become too sanguine about what can happen in space with these enormously complex vehicles?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as I was noted many times earlier, NASA's a victim of its own successes here, and people have begun to accept anything that NASA does is guaranteed to work, and fortunately it has up to this point. But all of us in the business recognize that it's still high technology and there's some risk associated with it, and sooner or later you're going to have a failure. Nobody ever built the perfect machine yet, and the shuttle certainly isn't, but it's still a very good machine. I'm confident they'll sort the problem out, and we'll press on with the program. You learn from your mistakes.
I'm not asking you to be unduly critical of your old agency, but do you think that NASA was too public relations oriented in getting civilians to fly on the shuttle?
Well, my opinion has always been nobody should ever fly in a space flight that doesn't have a good reason to be on. It's still not at the stage where you're going to haul people along for a joyride. It's not for me to evaluate the importance of each crew member on each flight. And certainly there's some merit in having a teacher on board this one in terms of fostering education in the country, particularly the science and technology related education. And so it's not for me to judge whether that was worth the sacrifice or not. That'll take history to do that. But I don't believe anybody should go that doesn't have a good, solid reason to be there.
You're a kind of competitor of NASA now. You're involved with a private program that hopes to launch its own set of satellites from private enterprise and so on. Do you think that the United States has invested too much of its space resources in the shuttle program? That is, that we've got too many eggs in that one basket?
Well, no, not really. We're not a competitor in a very strong sense. We're dealing in a different segment of the market, but as far as the bigger payloads are concerned, that is true. The country has made a big investment in the shuttle, and that's considered to be the wave of the future, primarily because one envisioned being a reusable system that would be cheaper and more economic, and obviously things will happen in space faster if transportation up there is cheap. But there is a potential single point failure there if this turns out to be a generic type problem that requires shutting the whole fleet down for a year or so, which is not impossible. We'll have a serious problem. And I think it probably would be wise to have a backup capability in this country, a launch capability, and that's what the old expendables, which are considered obsolete, can still provide you for many, many missions. So I still think the country needs to carry an expendable capability along with the great things the shuttle can do.
What was your immediate reaction, Dick Slayton, when you saw that videotape of the explosion today? Personal?
Well, it caught me not totally by surprise because I knew the thing had happened. So I was just looking to try to detect, if possible, what might have failed at what point. And that was my prime interest in watching it.
Did you know any of the astronauts on board?
Pleasant sight.
Did you know any of the astronauts on board?
Oh, yeah, I knew them all. Yeah, I worked with them and knew them all very well.
And you've been at this business a long, long time, both as a pilot and as an astronaut. Do you ever get in a mindset that you can deal with the emotional impact of something like this?
Well, sure. I've been doing it for about 45 years, so you don't ever get to the point where you enjoy it, but you got to learn to cope, and this is what goes with progress. Flight has always been a risky business. It'll always be risky, particularly the front end of it. And some things go wrong nobody has any control over, and when it happens, you've had a bad day, and you press on and make the best of it. And unfortunately, that's what happened here, but we'll learn from the problem and fix it and get on with it.
Dick Slayton in Houston, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I want to remind all of you that some stations now may want to cut away from our continuing coverage of this tragedy, the explosion on board